welcome to Rising. We're back after the 4th of July holiday. Hello, Briahna.
Hello, Robby. It's good to see you.
Nice couple days?
I did. It's always a pleasure to have a vacation, but I did miss doing the news at this desk with
Same.
you.
I was ready to get back into it. Now, of course, we were actually here the last 2 days through the magic of television. We were in multiple places at once, but no, I was very eager to get back into the chair and
a lot of news
topics.
happened over the weekend.
It did, and we're going to get to it. Let's start with some of unfortunately, the violence we saw over the last couple days.
Yeah, well, Independence Day across the nation were marred by gun violence and another round of holiday weekend shootings. News Nation reports that July 4th is becoming one of the nation's most violent days. Last year, over 200 people were shot dead and more than 500 were wounded. This year, 9 people, including a 9-year-old boy, were injured here in D.C. last night when someone drove by and opened fire on a holiday block party. Meanwhile, a 7-year-old was shot dead in Tampa Bay last night after an altercation between two groups celebrating the 4th on the beach escalated to gunfire.
And then in Philadelphia, 4 men and a 15-year-old boy were killed after a bulletproof vest-wearing assailant indiscriminately opened fire on pedestrians while having an assault rifle. That was on Monday night. Police identified that shooter as 40-year-old Kim Brady Carricker. The Post-Millennial reports that Carricker is a transgender woman who apparently made posts supporting Black Lives Matter in 2020, et cetera. And actually, I was seeing subsequent reporting on that individual 20 years ago did have was charged with not improperly carrying a weapon and not having a license, a permit for the weapon that they had. Now, that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, and it is worth noting, I guess, since we are specifying the gender identification of everybody who does the shootings, that and all of those other shootings, and presumably the hundreds that we described happened last year as well, all of those people identified as cis.
Sure. What jumps out at me with these incidents we're describing is actually an incredible variation. So that case is the closest to what we think of as the mass shooter, seemingly deranged person shooting people at random. Many of these other shootings seemed like, in DC. They're suggesting it was targeted. The people that drove up in the van, the rival gang type thing. Then some, people drinking out in the sun all day, just feuds escalating, and because there's guns, can become lethal. So it's kind of a different problem in each case. It's not all the same at all.
Yeah, I mean, it makes one ask the question: what purpose grouping some of these events together serves? Is it a useful media story to say, well, this is one of the most dangerous days of the year, when it is potentially the result of an aggregation of factors? Any holiday where people are out of work and socializing with each other is ups the risk. Summers, as opposed to winters, up the risk. There's fireworks going off. I mean, there's all kinds of confounding factors. And if we're interested in what a public policy response would look like, is it useful to aggregate all of these things together when the solutions, some of which you can't get around, it's summer, it's hot, others of which there might be some workarounds, but aren't applicable to every single type of scenario that we've seen play out over the course of this past holiday and the holidays before.
Right. It's unfortunate. And there are, bystanders, people not involved in some of these. Like, for instance, in D.C., the van that pulled up and shot at people, again, it was targeted, but I think they hit some random individuals as well. That kind of thing, makes me say, obviously, I do want more of a policy response in cases like that. The perpetrators should be brought to justice, and I bet you'll find in a lot of those cases that they have weapons, illegal weapons that they're not supposed to have anyway. So I'm fine enforcing those things more robustly, although sometimes that, in order to do that, the police have to engage in more surveillance and profiling and things that make me as a libertarian and probably you and a lot of people in our society very uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's also a question of cracking down on gun sales. And one of the talking points that's become very popular is to point to Chicago in particular as a city with a lot of gun deaths at the same time that it has Democratic leadership. And what many people in Chicago leadership who are very frustrated by the tragedy of all of these killings point out is that some enormous percentage of guns, illegal guns in Chicago, or guns period in Chicago, come from Illinois, which has Indiana, which has much less strict gun laws, and states like South Carolina, which is a huge hub for distributing guns across the country. So what do we do in a federalist system where people still have access to guns within their own nation just from a neighboring state, even if people in a particular locality are trying to respond to the real tragedy of all of these shooting deaths in their cities when they can't legislate beyond their city or state limits? It's a real conundrum.
Well, it is a conundrum, and I start to wonder, like, even if you somehow, if it was limited in all the states, would it pour in from across the borders? I mean, we do a bad job. We don't keep people out very well. We don't keep drugs out. We don't keep other things out.
Well, that's not the situation that we've had so far. America is one of, if not the world's leading gun manufacturer. And we have in this country, 3 guns for every person? Those are the statistics. We are very unique in the world on that score. And while I think that there could be many different causes to various kinds of gun deaths and tragedies that I described before, and of course, with a lot of these mass shooters, mental illness plays a role. It's hard to get around the reality of just how ubiquitous guns are in the United States of America. And we're not talking about legal gun ownership and all these kinds of things. You have a country where there's 3 times more guns than people, then it's going to be next to impossible to keep those guns out of the hands of people who want to do illegal harm to others, including on the 4th of July.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. A lot of violence across the city. We talk a lot about how many of our cities becoming more violent. There's more murder rate up in D.C., up in Philadelphia, up in a lot of these places. Confounded by the heat of the summer and poverty and the collapse of social institutions that we saw accelerated during the pandemic. It's a lot of young people involved in these crimes. It's overwhelmingly it's all. It's all men. It's all young men who, I wish there was more of a who don't have something else going on. I guess they don't have institutions to be a part of. They don't have communities that they're closely tied to. They've slipped through the cracks, and they're getting involved in bad stuff, frankly. And that's a major source of the problem, right?
The temperature thing is also an odd reality. I'm looking at this article, the CNN report, that shows that it's not just that July 4th has the most mass shootings of any other calendar date. It's that, generally speaking, the summer, I think July has the top, of the top 10 calendar days with the highest numbers of mass shootings since 2014, all but one, New Year's, was in June, July, or August. Yeah. So it really does speak to there being some kind of environmental, cultural, external factors that are driving a lot of this.
Is believed to have brought down the violence rate everywhere when it was introduced in cities, over the course of sporadically in different neighborhoods over the entire course of the 20th century. It brought down violence substantially. Yeah,
well, certainly if it's cool inside, that's an inducement to not be out in the streets, perhaps getting up to a little bit of trouble.
Right.
So, all right, we'll have more Rising right after this. Do stick with us.